Welcome to my channel, The Binge Eating Therapist. I'm Sarah, former binge eater turned psychotherapist, and my mission is to use this space to bring content to you to help you understand your struggle with food and break free from binge eating. And today's video is a questions and answers session. And they're your questions. I love hearing from you guys and hearing what's going on for you. And you certainly don't give me easy questions. Why don't you ask me whether I'm a cat or dog person? That would be much easier. But just kidding, I like the difficult questions. I like getting in there and wrestling with this stuff and thinking about how to think about it. And I'm not sitting here purporting to have all the definitive right answers for you, but hopefully I can respond in a way that will be thought-provoking and help you as you're figuring out your own path. So the first question was, I really think I have a problem with processed foods. They aren't natural, and I've read about how they overstimulate your brain. I'm seriously considering giving them up. Do you think this is a good idea? I don't see how I can do intuitive eating if my brain is working against me. Okay. So it's an interesting one when it comes to something like processed foods, because most people who are binge eating, those are the kinds of foods that they're attracted to. Not always, but a lot of the time that is the case. And there are some people out there who will insist that the way to recover from binge eating is to give up foods like flour and sugar and all the kind of processed foods. And food addiction is a really controversial subject, and anyone in the intuitive eating world will usually insist that food addiction doesn't exist because you cannot be addicted to something that you need in order to survive. But the thing is, what we do know is that processed foods have been designed by food engineers to be very stimulating. You know, they taste amazing. They trigger off a chemical reaction in the brain. That's true. They raise your blood sugar, they raise your insulin, like all of this. There's a whole chemical cascade going on in the body when you eat these foods. However, I'm so mindful saying this because what people who've struggled with eating disorders normally do with that information is they use it to set rigid rules, to beat themselves up about it, and to try and almost scare themselves into never eating these foods again. So when it comes to giving up these foods or not giving up these foods, from my personal experience and perspective, every time I tried to give up sugar, I ended up binging even worse. So for me, when I tried to give up these foods, it really perpetuated the black and white thinking, and all it would take is one slip or one perceived slip, and the rebound binging would be horrendous. And also there's a part of me, I'm quite rebellious, and so there's a part of me that needs to feel like I have choices. You take that choice away and that's all I can think about. That's my kind of temperament, if you like. And that's not to say that it might not be the right move for somebody else. I would never recommend anybody give up processed foods. However, if they say to me that they want to, I'm not going to dissuade them either. Like, try it, see what happens. I think the most important question to ask yourself if it comes to this, should you give up certain foods, is, does giving up those foods make me feel more free? For me, it made me feel less free. However, I do know of people out there who have regained their sense of freedom by not eating these foods, because then they don't have to deal with the ups and downs, they don't have to deal with the cravings or the overstimulation in the same way, because they tend to kind of die down a bit. And I think it might be a lot as well to do with your emotional relationship with some of these foods, and how far they go back and how they've been used, and that might all be in the mix as well. So ultimately, I think each person needs to make a decision for themselves, but the way I see it is the goal is to be free, you know. And so when we make free our intention and our motivation, hopefully the path to freedom for us will become a little bit clearer. I wondered if you had anything to say about the grief that can occur when you stop binging. It's something that's very present for me. If you lose something of a dysfunctional coping strategy, and there's also something around acceptance of the losses that this brings. I think this is a really good point. And when I got this message, I actually replied to the person who was sending it to me, because I thought it's so true. And I don't think I've ever spoken about it in terms of grief and loss. Because ultimately, when you're in the chaos of binge eating and all you want is recovery, you don't want to be someone who struggles with this anymore. In those moments, all you can see is the advantages of recovery, right? And then when you try and make behaviours that perhaps might be considered more recovery type behaviours, you find yourself a sense of like missing something. There's a sense of loss. And when binge eating is a coping strategy, it really can become sort of your crutch through the world, something that you rely on that's so predictable. And even if you feel crap, at least it's a predictable kind of crap, as opposed to the chaos of the world that could throw anything at you. I remember, like, for me, binging worked so well. It was like just pressing pause on life and not having to think or deal with it or be believing that I should be doing this or I should be doing that. And so, yeah, there are times when life is tough where I might think, I wish I had a switch that I could just flip so I could just not have to deal with this for a while. And when I left my previous job in order to become a therapist, I loved my previous career. It was such a big part of my identity and who I was. And so it was really tough to leave. And when I left, I was really taken aback by the strength of my feelings, which looking back now I can see was grief. And I grieved. I was in that proper grieving process for about 8 months after I left my last job. And that idea, though, even though it was so painful to leave, I left because I really wanted to do this. So it wasn't about like my job had to be terrible in order for me to leave it. And I think it might be a little bit like this with binge eating. This idea that leaving the binge eating behind actually may feel like an enormous loss. But it's that hope that actually, no, I want this even more, that gives you that sense of purpose, of like, why put yourself through the discomfort of recovery if there's not some hope that this is where you want to be or this is where you need to be. That's certainly what it felt when I left my job, was this idea of like leaving something and stepping into the unknown, because I thought this was what I really wanted, and it turned out that it was. And I used to be a bereavement volunteer at Cruise Bereavement Care, and I did some bereavement counselling, and they used to have a saying in Cruise, because basically, so if I'm telling you that there could be grief, then people are going to want to know, well, what do I do with this grief? And there used to be this saying at Cruise that you don't do grief. Grief does you. Like, grief just needs to be acknowledged and felt in order for you to let go and in order for the loss to occur, because there's so much that has to be let go of in order to recover from binge eating. You have to let go of the idea of perfectionism, like the idea of this perfect way of eating. You let go of this idealized version of yourself when you realize that recovery is just about kind of mediocrity to some degree, and mediocrity is the worst thing for the black and white or perfectionist thinker. But actually within it there's a sense of freedom and more stability in your sense of self. So what happens often when people start to recover is they get really excited about recovery. And that's all very well, but if we don't acknowledge the loss of the binge eating, at some point that's going to catch you off guard. And at some point it's going to be something that almost comes out of the blue and you end up back in a binge before you know it, because you're imagining you're going to feel great all the time, and you're not. You're going to miss it sometimes. And that doesn't mean you haven't recovered just because you have moments where perhaps you miss binge eating and what it was able to give you. Anyway, I hope that makes sense. That felt a bit rambly. Is full recovery from binge eating actually possible? I feel like I'm just doomed to struggle with food one way or another. So a lot of people like to hope that recovery means being a normal eater and feeling calm about food and pretty much knowing what you need to eat most of the time. And maybe to use an analogy of, let's take somebody who really struggles with their anger. They have an anger management problem and they're exploding all over the place at people, and it's causing a real problem in their life. It's dominating their life. So they go to therapy and they do the work on their anger management, and they have tools and they're able to cope with it, and they get to a point where the anger no longer rules their life, chances are they're always going to be someone who are vulnerable to being angry. It may be something that always needs to be kept in check a bit, and if they allow themselves to just kind of bumble through life unconscious, that the anger might take over again. And I think binge eating might be quite similar. Like, it becomes such an ingrained part, and it's so tied in with identity and just how your brain is used to thinking about food, becomes kind of automatic. So recovery can mean perhaps having the coping skills to manage some of the challenges around food. I can't say that, I've thought for ages that when I was in my eating disorder, that what I needed to do was get back to the place I was with food before my eating disorder. And that's what I was trying to do, like trying to get back. And it wasn't until I realised actually I needed to try and move forward and build something new. My relationship with food is not the same as it was before my eating disorder. How can it be? Like, this was something that used to rule my life and was so inherently tied in with my sense of self-worth and existence and all the big existential things. So we really need to think about, with the question full recovery, like, what does full recovery even mean? So for me, recovery is about feeling calm around food. And that's where I say I am. Like, I feel really calm around food pretty much all the time. And I don't judge myself for my food choices in the way that I used to. And so that keeps me on a much more even keel. And there's an element of always sort of bringing myself back into balance. Again, if I feel like I'm going slightly off balance, I know how to bring myself back and to keep grounding myself. It's not that I never go off balance a bit, but I keep bringing myself back. It doesn't turn into like a 2-week or 2-month cycle of binge eating, you know, like it used to, if I find myself in a place where I'm feeling a little bit uncomfortable about my eating. So I think the expectation of recovery, and I know this is not what people want to hear, because they want to hear that recovery is this magical place that you get to and everything's fine when you're there. But recovery is that idea of sort of living in the messy middle. And I absolutely do think that's possible for people. And also, when you talk about recovery, often it's quite binary. So you're saying, I'm not recovered or I am recovered. But let's say your chaotic relationship with food is a 1, and that idealized recovery is a 10. Even living at a 5 surely is better than living at a 1. Until we get to that point, it's harder to make progress, because we want to go from 1 over to 10 and then just stay there for the rest of our lives. So. And then the last question, is binge eating a habit? I've heard that it's just an ingrained habit. Just a habit. Habits are not just habits a lot of the time. Certainly when it comes to food, because food is such a complex issue for us. So let's say something like brushing your teeth might be a habit. I know it's the really cliched habit that everyone refers back to when they talk about habits. But if you were to decide to try to brush your teeth with your non-dominant hand for the rest of your life, that would feel really clunky and awkward for quite a long time, and it'd be quite hard to motivate yourself to keep it up, because it's much easier and more comfortable and feels right to do it with your right hand. Now with food, there is such a habitual element to binge eating, sure. But the problem with something like binge eating is it's really tied in with your self-worth, it's tied in with your emotional health, it's tied in with your mental health, it's tied in with quite often like relationships as well. So there's so many other layers to it that yes, it's a habit, but like the habit part here on the top, and there's all this stuff underneath. So absolutely go and do the habit work. There's that brilliant book by James someone, Atomic Habits, which is a really, really good book on habits. So my advice, if you're wondering whether your binge eating is a habit or how much of it is just habit, do some habit work. Approach it, like experiment. You are your own test subject. Go out there and go, okay, let me see if this is just a habit. What is there out there about how to change habits? Give it a go. Let me know. So, on that note, I'm going to say goodbye for now, and I'll see you on the next video.